Hello everyone, welcome to today's Insight Hour. Very pleased to have you on the call today. I'm just going to give it a couple of minutes to let people come in. Hi everyone, welcome to those joining. Just going to give it a couple of minutes. Got quite a few people registered today, so just going to give it a few minutes of people to get into the call. Hi everyone, you're joining EIDA's Insight Hour. Just giving it a minute for people to join. You can see the numbers going up, and then we'll get started. I'll go at 1 minute past. Please feel free to introduce yourselves in the chat there. I can see some people are writing hello. Okay, I think we'll get started. So, hi everybody, welcome to EIDA's Insight Hour. I'm Aisha Fordham, the Head of Membership and Engagement at EIDA. EIDA is a network of around 1,900 employer members across the UK. Our mission is to equip employers to support all their employees impacted by domestic abuse and to share best practice with employers. We aim to bring about constructive change, leading to a society where survivors thrive and where domestic abuse is not tolerated. Today's topic is looking at the long-term impacts of domestic abuse, insights for employers. We're hoping you'll have some key takeaways from the session today. Just a few points of housekeeping before I hand over to our speakers to introduce themselves. We'll be taking questions at the end of the session, so please use the Q&A box if you have any questions throughout. The participants can also use the chat function, so please feel free to write any questions, write any instructions or introduce yourselves in the chat to each other. Please feel free to use that. It will be managed by one of the EIDA team as well, and we'll be putting some information in there throughout. Please do refrain from posting any questions in the chat because they could be missed. So please do use the Q&A for any questions that you have. We encourage people to post on LinkedIn as the session's going or afterwards. Please follow EIDA and tag us as well. It's the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse on LinkedIn. Please do be mindful of the impact on others in what you're saying in the chat or on social media. The Insight Hour is being recorded today to help us prepare a summary, which we will be sharing within our newsletter in the coming weeks, so please keep an eye on it. You can sign up to the newsletter on our website if you would like to receive that. That's where we share all of our resources and event invitations. Now, we do recognise that domestic abuse is a challenging topic, and we'll be hearing personal experience of domestic abuse today. So please do look after yourselves and step away from the webinar at any time if you need to have a moment, and do seek support afterwards. We have a directory of support services available on the EIDA website, and it's being posted in the chat, so please do have a look at that if you need any information. So the focus of today's Insight Hour is looking at the long-term impacts of domestic abuse, how this manifests in the workplace, and what employers can do to support employees. It's a common misconception of domestic abuse that when the abusive relationship or situation ends, the abuse stops and the individual is free to move on with their life. We know this is not the case for many victim survivors, and it's really important for employers, colleagues, family and friends to understand this and to understand why. So today we are joined by three brilliant speakers. We've got Sharon Livermore, Craig Newman and Carrie Bauer, who are going to talk us through how domestic abuse can have a long-lasting impact on an individual, sharing key takeaways for how employers can help. I'm going to ask each of the speakers to introduce themselves. Sharon, if I can come to you first.
Hello, everyone. It's great to be here. I am Sharon Livermore. I am a domestic abuse survivor. I'm also a campaigner, proud ambassador for the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse, and the founder of Domestic Abuse Education. Thank you.
Thanks, Sharon. Craig, over to you.
Hello, I'm Craig Newman. I'm a clinical psychologist and also a chartered coaching psychologist. I developed the Get Out, Get Love recovery model after domestic abuse, which is now an international book, and a digital recovery program, which I'll be talking about later. So nice to meet everybody.
Brilliant. Thank you, Craig. And Carrie.
Hello everybody, I'm Carrie Bauer from Visible Later Lives. I specialise in domestic abuse in later life, but here to talk particularly about those colleagues and employees that are approaching retirement.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Carrie. Okay, so we're going to start with, so the way the session is going to run is we're going to have presentations from each of the speakers, and then we're going to do the Q&A at the end. So please have those questions ready and post them in the Q&A box throughout, as I said. So Sharon, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thank you very much. And it's great, as I say, to be here today. So just to reiterate who I am again, I am the founder of Domestic Abuse Education and an ambassador for the Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse. I am going to be sharing my experience with you today. It will be limited experience because obviously we don't have lots of time, but to obviously share that experience with you. So I lived through 18 months of domestic abuse, experiencing every form of abuse apart from economic abuse, to the point where I hit what I say is an internal brick wall. I'd lost my identity. I lost who I was. I'd lost my friends and family around me. And one day I stood up at work and said, I'm done. I can't do this anymore. So at that point, my boss, who'd had no education around domestic abuse, did her best to support me. And I went to the police station the next day. It was 2015, so coercive control was only just coming in as a prosecution. And at that point, I didn't have any physical bruising on me. So I managed to speak to the police, and I thought that my perpetrator would be arrested and charged. Unfortunately, he was released, and I went about my day to day as I was trying my best to do. I worked every single day throughout this because work was my safe space. It was around 5 days afterwards. I left work with one of my colleagues, and we worked in an absolutely gorgeous building. It was a converted barn. So as you can imagine, very privileged to work there, but there was no security. It was November as well, so cold and dark outside. And we walked across the car park to our vehicles at the end of the day, and we got into them. They were parked next to each other. And we had a bit of an ongoing joke where my car was newer than hers. So I used to be able to demist my vehicle and off I would go much quicker than her. So I'd give her a wave. But that evening, I got into my car and she drove off, and my car was still steamed up. So I was left sitting there thinking, well, this is really, really strange. I looked behind me and I thought, oh, thank goodness, a bit like a horror film, in all honesty. And he wasn't sitting there. But then I smelled aftershave, and the smell of aftershave was so strong. I say it was like having a sixth sense, or I now believe I have a guardian angel, because the feeling I had let me know I was in danger. So I took my hand and I put it behind me in the footwell of my vehicle, and I felt a picnic blanket. Now, that picnic blanket had been in the boot of my car. I have OCD, so I know where everything is. My vehicle was still running, and at that point it was all a bit of a blur, but I walked round to the back of the vehicle, lifted up the boot, and in the boot of my car was my then husband with knives, cable ties and masking tape. Thankfully, I managed to run, and one of my colleagues came out as well as two gentlemen from another building. He did capture me, but I managed to go down and protect myself, at which point he soon realised that he was overpowered by the number of people and fled in my vehicle. The vehicle, he fled in that vehicle, and the police subsequently caught him and he went to prison. But he'd spent 3 days plotting what would have been my kidnap and my murder. He had gone to my home and angle grinded through the back door to steal the spare car key. He then drove to near where I worked, left his car, got into my vehicle and loosened the seats. And if I'd have driven off in that car, I would not be here today sharing my story with you. So that is how my experience came to an end, shall we say. So if we could move through the slides, please, to the stats, that would be wonderful. So I just wanted to showcase to you a few stats as well around this topic and the importance of workplaces being educated. So it's the cost of £7,245 on average to the employer per survivor and lost output. 56% of employers said that domestic abuse led to absenteeism, and 54% said it caused the quality of their employees' work to suffer. And then 2% of employees lose their jobs as a direct result of domestic abuse. A lot of this comes from not just the experience they're going through, but the trauma that people are living through as well. So I just wanted to showcase these stats to you. So next slide, please. And then that brings me on to my trauma journey and why you are all here today to learn from my experience as well. So there's different stages in my particular journey. When I was in the relationship, of course, I was traumatized. Every day I was having panic attacks. Driving home, I had to pull over sometimes because of the fear of what was going to happen when I got home. But also when I got home, it was that anxiety the whole time. I was living in a state of just overwhelmed with emotions without an outlet of people or support to talk to. So it was an absolutely horrendous place to be in. But we expect people to be traumatized when they're in an abusive relationship. When it then ended, of course, at that point, when I guess I realized what happened that evening, I was traumatized, but I was also relieved because he was then sent to prison. So for me, there was a sense of relief that overtook the trauma at that point. If, however, which is in a lot of cases, the perpetrator doesn't go to prison, that victim would be left feeling is still extremely anxious, probably even more anxious, waiting to know what was going to happen next, like I was for those few days, because it doesn't just end. So again, it is more common that we would expect people to be traumatized at the end of that relationship. The bit where there's the misconception for victims is that it ends at that point. But if I talk you a bit through more of my journey, my court case happened around 7 months after the night that I nearly lost my life. And in those 7 months, I had started to, I guess, rebuild my life as best I could. But it was at that point that was the worst for me. The court case was worse than the time when it happened. And that was because I just started to rebuild my life. And I had to take myself back to the point of reliving that nightmare, which I'd actually closed off in my head. I hadn't realized that I closed it off, but to then stand up in a courtroom and have to relive every moment of my whole entire relationship, and then obviously the situation, that was really, really hard. And understanding that, which I didn't understand at that point, was quite hard to come to terms with, because I assumed that as soon as I found out that he'd been fully charged and was obviously sent to prison for a long period of time, that all of a sudden my life would be better. But actually that didn't happen. And at that point, I really, really struggled. I struggled to focus. I struggled to sleep. I struggled to even look after myself and eat properly, although I was doing my very best to get through that period. As time went on, thankfully, I was able to rebuild my life, which took time. It really does take time and patience and working on yourself with the support of others. And then I managed to move on with my life and rebuild it. But then in 2023, which was 8 years after this all happened, my perpetrator was released from prison. Now, I convinced everyone around me and myself that I was absolutely fine, and I was good and I was organised. I had police intervention. I had every safety measure that you can think of. But the minute I got that phone call, it felt like my world came crashing down again. I had to make adjustments for myself. Now, I run my businesses, so I didn't have to go to my employer and say, do you mind if I leave work at 3:30 in daylight? And I'm not sure how long for, because at that point, I honestly didn't know. But being able to make those adjustments was huge for me, because I had control over that situation. My panic attacks came back as well. Again, I wasn't sleeping, and there was anxiety of every move that I was making. I was looking over my shoulder. That, of course, had an implication on me and the work I was doing. But as I said before, I didn't have to answer to an employer to say, this happened 8 years ago, and I could really do with your support. I got through that period, and we're now 10 years this year that it happened. But I still have situations that I live with in my life now. I am re-traumatized, and it can come from nowhere. So to give you some examples, if I smell aftershave, the aftershave that he was wearing, I will freeze. I go into freeze mode. It's happened when I've been in shopping centres and someone's walked past me. I just freeze. The smell just takes me back to that moment, and it takes my emotions back with it. So I have to then work through those emotions and get myself back to the place where I need to be. Another example was a few weeks ago, I went to the shops after work and it was dark and I was due to go meet my dad for dinner, and I'd obviously knocked my mirror in the car. So I ran into the shop, got what I needed, came back, pulled out the parking space, went around the car park. And then when I went to look in my mirror, I realized my mirror had moved. At that moment, the fear that I felt was the same fear when I was in the car. I honestly thought that there was someone sitting behind me and they'd moved my mirror down. I tried my best to talk myself down, which I'm usually able to do now, but I couldn't. And I was driving through the town where I live, and I thought I can't go another 3-4 miles down the road to meet my dad. So I found a lay-by. There was a lorry, and I could see a gentleman in the lorry. So I pulled up in front of his lorry, and I thought, if something happens, there's someone there. And I got out and I checked my car. Now, half of my brain is going, this is not going to happen again. But the other half overtook on that day, and I had to check the car. And then, of course, that re-triggered me. I then didn't sleep very well for the next few weeks. I then kept going back into those moments. But again, that's part of my life. I will live with this, I'm pretty sure, for the rest of my life. I have learned to cope with it and accept that it is part of my life. But it means that people around me need to understand that as well. And when I need it, offer me support. So I'm really lucky that I have that in my space with my colleagues and my family as well. But the one thing I would ask all of you to do is, if you have employees that are experiencing trauma at any point, if you work with them, you will get the best out of them, because they will be able to regain that control of themselves and seek the support they need without the fear of being judged or not being supported by their workplace. So I really would encourage all of you to take a look and understand that it can carry on, but it doesn't make that person any less able to do the things in life that they need to do. They just need to be able to reach out and ask for support. So I really appreciate you listening to what I've said there. And I know we will have some questions at the end if anybody wants to ask me anything.
Thank you so much, Sharon, sharing
you.
this. Yeah, thank you, Sharon, for sharing your story there, and for being so honest about how it's impacting you now and the reality of how you feel that it will continue to impact you, for the long term going forward in your life. So I really appreciate your honesty there. I just wanted to pick up on something that you said there. So you talked about how, as a business owner, you now have autonomy of your own diary and you can leave work if you need to. After you left your abusive partner, when you were employed by somebody else, were there any challenges you faced in getting the ongoing support for the longer term that you actually needed at that point?
Yeah, absolutely. And at the time, my employer wasn't educated, which is obviously why I do the work I do now. But it was the lack of empathy and understanding, not at the time that it happened, because everyone was so supportive. It was with the court case. So obviously that was 7 months after, and they assumed because he'd been locked up for 7 months, he was remanded in custody, that I'd rebuilt my life, everything was great, and I was just going to go and almost just relive something that wasn't going to have an impact. So that was really, really hard to process and deal with. I personally had to take annual leave rather than compassionate leave, but I was still called by my employer, even though I was on annual leave, when I was going through the court case, asking how I was going to do things next week when I got back into work, had I reorganized stuff. That was so traumatic because I just didn't know what to do. And actually a family member had to step in and speak to my employer and say, look, she needs some time. So it was just that lack of, I think it's the compassion and the empathy and the understanding that this is a really horrific time. And obviously I appreciate my case, as we know, is quite far-fetched with what happened, but anybody who experiences abuse will be potentially re-triggered at different times. It's not just a court case, it's an anniversary, it's just like me smelling aftershave, for example, or seeing someone in the street or something like that. So we just need to be mindful. And I don't think businesses truly understand the difference that they actually do make when they are supportive to their employees.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. And
Thank
that,
you.
the empathy and the compassion there, no matter how many resources or how large the organization is, that's something that any organization can provide to their employees. So a key takeaway there for employers and people on the call. So thank you so much, Sharon.
Thank you.
Craig, over to you. So Craig is going to talk about how trauma manifests in the workplace and what employers can do to support employees. So Craig, I'm going to pass over to you to your slides. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Sharon, as well. Powerful stories. We're brave to share those stories. I want to talk about relational trauma, relationship trauma, and its effect in the workplace, and the work we're doing to support businesses with this. And it really builds on Sharon's story, so it's actually great to hear that told as a real life experience. I'm a clinical psychologist. I'm also a domestic abuse survivor myself. I spent a lot of time after that trying to understand recovery, because there's actually not a great deal written about how to recover from domestic abuse in psychological models. I went on to develop a recovery model, and I want to talk to you a little bit about that as well. So you've had some statistics from Sharon, and I think it's really important to build on Sharon's experience. And that's the first thing I felt about Sharon's experience is how common it is in the experience of people I've worked with. Really common stories about people having lots of complexity after they've left. And this is really the point I want to make, which is that when people leave abuse, they don't really leave usually. For most people, something like 90% prevalence, there's some post-relational abuse, and that can be years or decades. For many of these people, they leave with PTSD, although I would hazard that that's actually complex PTSD. They have a 3 times risk of anxiety and a 4 times risk of depression. And in all NHS mental health services, 50% of women are there because they've experienced domestic abuse. It is, in the UK, the primary cause of mental health issues. It hurts you as businesses as well, and it actually hurts you financially. But these financial costs, they come from the effect that your staff experience. Their careers affected, they lose confidence, they have to do all sorts of behaviours at work to manage the abuse, and then after the abuse, when they're facing trauma, they, as I say, will be going to work with PTSD, with mental health problems. So that figure that Sharon gave of 7,245, that figure actually is the figure of people's impact on businesses when they're in domestic abuse. There's actually little known or even measured after they leave. After they leave, I would argue they enter the same figures as people with mental health conditions, which is reported at £1,600 a year. So if you're not addressing this trauma, the cost can actually be very high. Some of you may know that the government are probably going to bring in a safe leave policy. This has already happened in some parts of Europe, and it's a really sensible thing to do to support staff. In reality, staff take leave anyway. As Sharon said, they go off sick or they take leave. It's probably important for businesses to help. It introduces a massive amount of complexity. Who do you give this to? Who has abuse and who doesn't? What about if 2 of your staff who are in a relationship both claim they're the victims? Because 17% of people who are in abuse are in abused by their co-worker who's also their partner. What happens in the context of cycles of abuse, people going in and out of their relationship and asking for leave again? I'm going to make the point that the maintaining factor here for businesses is in fact trauma. This is the entry point for businesses. You want to tackle this, you need to tackle trauma. So if we think about people leaving relationships, there's a kind of journey that happens for them and businesses. They leave a relationship, they probably have left with complex trauma. This is long-term. It's unresolving for many people if they don't get support. It's maintained by post-relational abuse, by complex divorces, and certainly by co-parenting. In fact, many of the clients I work with have got co-parenting challenges for many years. The outcome, mental health issues, sick days, presenteeism, lost career progress, and staff retention issues. And actually, in the long term, staff retention problems are about 10% reported by the TUC. What can be done in an ideal world? Specialist support is provided where people receive either specialist long-term therapy. I don't have enough to say on this, but that is rarely provided by EAPs. And we have a program that we've put into this space. What you're hoping to do with this is to resolve that trauma, to break cycles of going back into relationships, to teach people really key skills, how to manage divorces, how to manage triggers at work, how to manage co-parenting, build up their confidence, get them present, and of course, increase their loyalty to their employers if they're supported well. Oh, seems to have lost the click. Problem is there are serious barriers. The barriers are people often work with their abuser. 70% of people who experience domestic abuse are very ashamed. They feel they have to keep it to themselves. They will not report it to their employer. And actually, there isn't a long-term support option anyway. So if they did tell their employer, and as Sharon said, if they go to their employer 7 months later, 3 years later, in some of the cases, people I've worked with 10 or 15 years later, what is their employer going to do? And what actually tends to happen is, while this isn't being addressed, this trauma leads to cycles of abuse. People often return to abuse, often return to problematic situations. They attract difficult relationships and, in fact, can create drama, which I'm about to talk about. Before we move forward, I just want to really say something about the word trauma, because people have got their ideas about what trauma is. I've been a trauma specialist in many contexts. I've done trauma work with veterans from war, trauma work with people who've had incidents at work, and of course, people who've been abused. The trauma that comes from abuse is very unique. The people who've experienced it have experienced trauma and coercion, which is really important to try and understand. Some of you may have experienced it, and for others, you may be very interested. But just really hold in mind that for many people, they may have experienced thousands of incidents over years of being threatened, being denigrated, controlled, devalued, made to feel it's their fault. I mean, the list goes on. It is not just the experience of fear, it is the actual shaping of an individual's relationship with the world. And that takes work and support for people to get over. I, as well as being a clinical psychologist, as I said at the start, I am a coach, and I've coached some very senior teams and CEOs, boards, and even the very top directorates in the NHS. I'm going to give you 2 stories of where I've seen trauma manifest in work, just to give you a kind of a sense of what I mean by complex trauma and the workplace. So, sorry, I've come up with the name Sharon for this lady, so I don't mean our Sharon, but I've already planted it in my head. But everyone I'm naming here, I've given a pseudonym. I forgot Sharon was one of our speakers, but I worked with a team in a company of managers, and I was coaching them around essentially trying to be more cohesive. And when I worked with this team, they were kind of learning to give each other criticism, and one of the ladies there, Sharon, reacted very hostile to this in the room and became very angry at the team. And the team essentially told me, this is one of the problems. Sharon always does this. She's got a lot of power in the team, and we can't really talk to her. So I met with Sharon on her own. And in that space, Sharon and I were able to identify that she had actually experienced quite lengthy domestic abuse many years ago and had not really resolved that. And what was happening is the hypervigilance she had, the lack of trust, the new learned behaviors to never be a victim again were manifesting in her as receiving criticism or challenge at work as serious threat. Her body was still traumatized. Essentially, she was having an overreaction to normal workplace practice as an experience of threat. The other example I want to give, I'll call Tom. So all the statistics I said earlier, you can multiply all those by 3, particularly around prevalence if you work in the NHS and you're a nurse or a HCA. So in the NHS, we know that the rates of domestic abuse for staff are about 3 times higher than the rest of the workplace employers. But Tom works in the NHS, very senior director in a directorate board right up at the very top of NHS England. And Tom was brought to me essentially because he was really kicking off, is the fair description, in many meetings, and had actually gone to the lengths of leaking an NHS story to the press, which caused lots of problems that they weren't fully really able to pin it on him, but there was a lot of confidence it was him. I met with Tom and essentially was able to identify with Tom that he had also left a domestic abuse relationship and really struggled with women who he perceived were angry at him. He worked in a directorate where all of his managers and directors above him were women. He was having a very overreactive response to this and perceiving their challenges to him as attacks and denigration. These are both examples of complex trauma appearing in the workplace, and they don't get framed as anxiety or depression, but they are very costly and disruptive to businesses. What's missing, I think, for people is something that's accessible to them in terms of support. It's immediate, it doesn't matter what gender they have, it's long-term, it's confidential, so they don't have to face shame or declare to a manager. It's flexible, it accelerates their trauma recovery, and it works alongside ongoing abuse. And I'm going to introduce something we've done that we believe ticks all of these and also is very low cost. So we have created a solution called the Get Out, Get Love. goggle approach, which essentially invites people who've had a breakup to come and get support. And I'll tell you why we've done it as a breakup rather than domestic abuse in a few minutes. What they get in this is guided recovery that's been built from our team, videos, quizzes, exercises, but most importantly is toolkits. So we have a guided program of recovery for people that essentially helps them to understand what they've been through and to process that and to recover. But we also understand that's going to be interfered with by co-parenting challenges, really challenging divorce experiences, those triggered traumas, success at work challenges, the inability to stop talking about your experience at work, the struggles with focus, really a very long list. And we've built toolkits for people for all of these. So when they get disturbed in their recovery, they can actually turn to resources to help them in the moment. Who is this for? Well, we've built this for everyone in your organization that experience a breakup. They refer themselves, it's self-help, it's confidential. And what happens is they get assessed. If they're at high risk or they've not left, we signpost into the information they need and the services that can help with that. If they've had a difficult breakup without abuse, we put them through an 8-week program that helps them, maybe with a very difficult acrimonious divorce or a child contact challenge in which they're supported to get closure and to feel valuable about themselves. But if we identify they've likely experienced abuse, we very softly take them through a program that supports them for a year, getting understanding about that experience, learning how to get in control of their emotions and how to get that very important closure and processing of trauma. And we've built it to be very accessible. They can access it in just 3 minutes a day or more if you want to. We've done some research with this and it's been embedded in a number of contexts, actually used currently in some domestic abuse services in different regions in the UK. And as you can see, most people who use the program have a very strong opinion that it helps, particularly around being useful in times of crisis, understanding their experience and giving them a real sense that they can control their emotions and control their daily life. And these are, it's probably difficult for some of you to connect, but these are often what people say they really do struggle with when they have not got resolved trauma. Now, I've made a kind of ROI pitch here because I realize, this is very important to businesses. I really think the 7,000 figure is a massive underestimate. It only really captures people up until that point that, they come onto the system. And, once they've been spat out of domestic abuse services, people very rarely get support. If for a staff member has unresolved trauma or maybe has co-parenting or a very difficult divorce for 5 years, I'm sure you've all come across staff with these experiences, the costs in terms of productivity, sick leave, presenteeism, you could estimate could be anywhere from 10 to 15,000, potentially even more for critical staff, operational staff, medical staff. What we're proposing here is that businesses could pay a very fractional cost and be supporting their staff long term to get specialists and evidence-based support to actually help them process and recover from trauma. What does our program do? I mean, it kind of touches on what people really need. So we're currently the only offer we can find at the moment. There may be other offers in the future, but this is what those offers must be able to do. They must be able to support people to process trauma in the long term, to regulate their emotions, to understand how to control emotions and how to get new emotions. So lots of people are stuck with stress, anxiety, and they've got lots of emotions, but not really, pleasure, the ability to meet their own needs, and self-worth, and also critical life skills that support us in those times when we don't expect it. Like Sharon says, you hear about your ex leaving prison. That might sound extreme, but it really isn't extreme. I hear these stories all the time in the work that I do. But really what you want is any intervention needs to accelerate trauma recovery and really be thinking that that's what we're talking about here. It isn't just anxiety and depression. Productivity of team members hangs very much on where they are in their trauma recovery journey. We've got some words from our users, and we've had many users, but essentially, people describe what we do as transformative to them, having a massive impact, giving them a sense of relief and strength and not feeling alone and feeling that they've been guided towards support and recovery. So where we're at really today is we've come to introduce this to you along with the message that, we're trying to validate the stories of people like Sharon, that the trauma is the biggest part of the journey after escape. And we'd really like to help any of you that would like help, and please do get in touch with me if you'd like to discuss how we can support your team. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Craig. So much interesting information there. And what sort of really stood out for me is that the case studies that you shared and the examples of people that you've worked with, and that you're having people come to access the support from you 10 to 15 years after they've disclosed to get that support, and you're not feeling like they'll actually get support from their employer. And then providing that really useful information around the fact that they need that accessible support, the Get Out, Get Love programme, which is, it sounds fantastic. I'd really encourage people to have a look at it on the call. It needs to be part of their domestic abuse response, and that domestic abuse response within the organisation really needs to state that it's there for people for long term, wherever they are on their journey, because we know that people might not be wanting to access that support in the moment, but actually, as you've said, Craig, coming forward years later and getting that support through their employer. So some really great things to take away there. Thank you so much for sharing all of your expertise.
Thank you.
I'm now going to hand over to Carrie, who's going to talk about the long-term impact of domestic abuse on older people and how it impacts people later in their lives. Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks, Aisha. Can you see my slideshows at full screen?
Yes, all good. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you. Right, we're going to do an activity now. Thank you, Craig and Sharon. I'm going to focus on the impact of domestic abuse on colleagues that might be approaching retirement. And it will really very much follow on from what Craig was saying, but we will focus more on the physical impacts, although we will touch on trauma as well. So I want you to have a think about somebody in your life. They could be a family member, they could be a friend, a relative, a colleague, somebody that you know that is approaching retirement. So the person that I'm thinking of is 65. State retirement age is now 66, so they're due to retire next year. And they were born in 1960. So have a think about that person. If you have a piece of paper and a pen, try and work out what year they were born and pop it in a circle on a piece of paper. But feel free to use the chat if you prefer. I don't mind, whichever you prefer. Just have a think about that person. And we're going to go through some of the impacts that this, assuming that they are affected by domestic abuse, and they could be a victim survivor of domestic abuse. That's the terminology I will use today. But they could also be a perpetrator. And as I talk through, I want you to just scribble down some thoughts and words that spring to mind as I do that. So what we know is the workforce is getting older. We are at a unique point in history where some workplaces will have up to 5 generations of people working in the same workspace. And we have to think about historically how our attitudes and beliefs and values have been influenced by the past. We also need to recognise that the pool of potential perpetrators can increase as we age. So on your piece of paper, if that's what you're using, or the chat, think about those relationships. We focus quite a lot on intimate partners, husbands, wives, civil partners, former partners. Think about some of those other relationships that we have, the personal connections we have with people over the age of 16. That's the definition of domestic abuse, those relationships. So thinking about our own children, our grandchildren, nieces, nephews, cousins, siblings. Write those down around that date. You should have something, if you're doing this exercise, something that looks like this. And it starts to show the complexities of domestic abuse as we age. But equally, whilst those relationships, those people in our lives could be potential perpetrators of domestic abuse, we also have to recognise that as we age, we could be perpetrators of abuse, and therefore The harmful behaviour could go either way. So just have a think about some of those relationships and how complex that can become later in life. And I want to talk to you about the risks. So around that circle, if you're doing the activity, start to think about some of the things that Craig and Sharon have talked about, some of the psychological impacts, the trauma, how it might manifest in our behaviour, thoughts and feelings and reactions. But let's also think about some of the physical symptoms. What health conditions can you think of that might be correlated to domestic abuse? There's emerging research showing the correlation between many long-term health conditions and trauma and abusive behaviour. If anybody's ever heard of someone called Gabor Mate, he talks very much about the impact of trauma and autoimmune conditions. The Institute for Addressing Strangulation has published research around non-fatal strangulation, and the restriction of oxygen to the brain can cause things like memory loss, confusion, sensory impairments, stroke. BrainKind have recently published some research called Too Many to Count, which looked at brain injury and physical injury. Think about fractures, physical injuries caused by domestic abuse, and the long-term impacts. Write down some of those conditions. Write them down and have a look at how complex that image becomes. How many of those conditions, if that person is older, are often assumed and attributed to their age rather than the abuse that they have been subjected to? What we know from Safe Lives, so Safe Lives did some spotlight reports back in 2016, so they are quite old now, and there will be new research coming out, that nearly half of victim survivors of domestic abuse aged 60 and above have a disability or a long-term health condition. We often hear the narrative, oh, it might be carer stress, but actually, what came first? Many people will have that long-term health condition or disability as a direct result of domestic abuse. And then we have to consider, is that victim survivor now dependent on their perpetrator for their care and support? It's really complex. And what we're starting to see with this image that you have in front of you, if you're doing the activity, is this Petri dish where abuse can breed. We also know that over a quarter of victims of domestic abuse related deaths, so that's where somebody has ended their life by suicide or has been killed, where it's related to domestic abuse, over a quarter of them are aged over 55. We focus a lot on separation being a high risk time, and we know it is a high risk time and specialist support is needed. But we rarely consider retirement as being a high risk time. Think about retirement. For many of us, it's an exciting time full of opportunities, full of new adventures. But for some people, they will live in chronic fear of retiring, the isolation, the financial dependence, the close proximity to a perpetrator. Retirement is a really key time that we need to ensure, if you are a safe workplace, how do you prepare? How do you educate people that will soon be leaving the workplace? We rarely think about those people. We also have to think about this in the context of perpetrators who are retiring. What will a loss of status do? Will they have a need for further control? Will the risk escalate? I'm now going to invite you to look at a timeline. So back to that person, the person that I was talking about is born in 1960. So in the middle, I've put the date that they were born. They're 65. And I'm going to just show you a timeline really to illustrate the generational changes that they will have experienced. And we know that our formative years are often where our beliefs and values are shaped and how entrenched these beliefs can be. I'm not going to talk through this timeline mainly because of time, but I want you to have a look and think about some of the messaging that was out there, the references early on in the 70s. The focus was very much on physical violence and very much on women who were married, and the dependence that many married women had on their husbands. But actually, what did that narrative say to men? Think about the gender stereotypes. Think about how much of these behaviours were normalised early on in that person's life, and how difficult it is for attitudes and beliefs to shift, even when we have legislation changes. Think about coercive controlling behaviour became a criminal offence 10 years ago now, yet so many people have little understanding of the real impact. Now, this is my page. Yours will look different. Everybody's experience is unique, and that timeline will be different for different people. It can feel overwhelming and it can feel like a maze. How on earth, as employers, do you support somebody who has been either subjected to domestic abuse for a long period, or is living with the impact, or potentially is using harmful behaviour? How do you even begin? I'm going to give you 3 takeaways. You may have noticed I like things in threes. So what can you do as employers? Well, you can ensure resources are accessible. And as Craig mentioned, without needing to escalate to HR or a line manager, many people live with shame and stigma from domestic abuse. And even though we are trying to change that through awareness, for many, many older employees, that will still be entrenched. So it's really, really important that you have information accessible to people without them having to escalate to a manager. We also need to bear in mind there might be senior leaders who are using harmful behaviours. That means that you won't necessarily be able to measure the impact of the work that you're doing. Also be aware that retirement and redundancy could be high-risk times, and how do you offer support to employees before that happens? And finally, Sharon, I know you deliver lots of training in this topic, and Craig, you've talked about the Goggle app and the book that you have. There are lots of opportunities to deliver more specific training and workshops, and think about age when you're thinking about some of those specialist resources. I think I might have gone over time, so I'm open to questions, but feel free to contact me if you want any more information, and any of the data and research that I've mentioned, I'm happy to share the sources with afterwards. Stop sharing now.
Thank you so much, Carrie. That was fascinating. And I mean, we could do there's so much more work we can do in this area. The points you raised around retirement and, you know, encouraging employers to think about preparing their staff for retirement is, you know, one sort of thing that I really took away from that, something I've not really thought about before. So I think we should definitely do some more work around that area. Can I ask you, Carrie, to just share your page again, and if we can share it out with this, everyone can see now that your slides are down, and if we can share it out in the summary notes.
Yeah, I'll do a PDF and I'll put the sources of where I've got all that data and research, and I'll share that. Yeah, no problem.
Brilliant. Thank you. Okay, so just going to go to some questions now. So first question, now Craig talked through obviously the Goggle app and the support that's available, but can I ask if there's any other kind of practical ways that an employer might be able to support and thinking about it in the long-term perspective? Maybe Sharon, come to you in terms of being a business owner and how you might support your own people.
Yeah, absolutely. I think For me, obviously, I've turned my situation into a positive with now educating businesses across the UK, but also as a business owner myself. It's understanding, a lot of it comes from education around, what is domestic abuse? What are the signs we're looking out for? So recognizing them, being able to respond and have those conversations with people, because it's really hard, whether you're a business owner, a line manager, HR wellbeing, or a colleague, having those conversations around a sensitive topic can actually be quite hard to start. People feel like it's not their business, but as we know, domestic abuse is everyone's business. So having that education around that, and then being able to understand what a referral pathway looks like, because the one thing that I come up against from employers is where is our boundary? Because we don't want to have the responsibility of saving that person, which I totally get, because when we're working with trauma and domestic abuse, it is a scary time. But by referring to the support services and to the support that's out there, obviously with Craig providing his support there as well, we can potentially save lives by following that pathway. So I think, if people are listening to this, irrelevant of whether you employ one person or you employ 10,000 people, there are things that you can do, genuine things that will make a difference. And it realistically is about referring to those support services.
Thank you, Sharon.
Thank you.
We've had a couple of questions in advance. I'm just going to read out if that's okay, and for anybody to chip in if you feel you can answer them. So we've noticed a significant shift in workplace attitudes towards domestic abuse and supporting colleagues who are victim survivors. Businesses are getting better at recognising signs and providing support during those crucial first days post-escape. The EIDA conference last September, highlighted the extensive impacts during prosecution, custody battles and divorce proceedings, emphasising the need for long-term support strategies. Do you have any examples of employers excelling in this area that you can share?
I guess if you come, yeah, I'm happy to comment on this. I don't necessarily think in my space that I hear of all the success stories, because I work one-to-one with the organisations. But I do know that, the ones that we've educated, the ones that Employers Initiative on Domestic Abuse have educated, they will look into this, because we talk about this in the policy that we created alongside each other as well. We bring it to people's attention that trauma doesn't just stop, which is what we've been speaking about. So I think there will be success stories, because people just having that empathy, which is what we touched on at the very start, and being able to work with that individual, because as Carrie said, everyone's story is different as well. So working with the individual. So I'm sure, I haven't heard any personally myself, but I'm sure from the work that we're all doing, there will be some success stories longer down the line as well.
I think it's important to acknowledge that it's only really just had the light shone on it. Yeah. So I think that it's very complex. So a lot of people didn't understand a lot about depression, anxiety 10, 15 years ago in terms of the workplace. This is very complex, and it's important, as you've just said in that question that's been asked, to recognize that people don't just leave. Like they have masses of complexity after. They have divorce cases that can include lots of abuse. They have co-parenting for maybe 10, 15 years that can include a lot of abuse. There's something about getting employers to recognize that that will create interference, and it's probably just par for the course. If you employ people, you're going to be employing people who've been abused. But support is a long-term thing, and part of that is helping the individual to understand their stake in it. So what I mean by that is, if you are going through these experiences, how can you empower yourself as an employee? And that's why we built our program. So there's in part thinking about how employers empower themselves, but employees as well need some support and understanding what power they have, and how they can use that.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. And that's a really great point. And I think, it's those employers that are excelling in this area, those that really understand that and really are including that long-term impact within their wider response, and not just thinking about it in terms of that point of exit, or that point of disclosure, but actually what are they doing as an organisation within all of their processes to really make sure that that person feels supported throughout their entire journey. Thank you. So the other question we had in advance was, we often see managers almost lose patience with colleagues that aren't ready to escape an abusive relationship. how might we better take our managers on the journey that if the colleague wants to stay in a relationship that might be abusive, that we still need to show up for them and be supportive?
I mean, that's incredible. That's what we experience as therapists as well. And so do domestic abuse services. It's very difficult to work in a space where your support, you believe, should result in a person leaving a bad situation. We've written articles about how to support people. That the way to support people really is to acknowledge that you see they're in a difficult place. Really don't ham up the word abuse, because that's the fastest way of turning off anyone from engaging with you. That you recognize that's a struggle. You recognize without saying it that will be cyclical. So that staff member may say, I'm going to leave, and then next day say, I'm not. And just to give very good access to the information that they need and to let them know where that is. So where is the signposting? Where is the risk? The only time that varies is if you actually witness violence, risk that you can't ignore. None of us can ignore when we've got the responsibility with people. Sometimes you have to take the step of contacting services yourself, but that's only under real risk to people's well-being. That gets more confusing around coercive control, but the main point really is to say to be supportive is to be present, to not be judging a person, to not be demonstrating that frustration, and to recognize that people, the main symptom of abuse, the main two symptoms are shame and self-blame. Most people don't think they're being abused. They think they are causing the problem and they're ashamed you've seen it. So, you have to be very patient for that to change for people.
Yeah.
Can I just come in on that one quickly, just with a quick tip for people here? When I've been obviously working with organisations, there's this misconception that if a victim speaks to a frontline support service, they have to leave that relationship. So they won't even come forward. Whereas actually, if we can create a culture where everyone in the business knows that potentially there'll be a safe space for them to, if they can, speak to a support service, you're giving them the control and the opportunity to speak to support services to find out what their life may look like. And then if they choose to stay in it, that's up to them. But there's this misconception that if you speak to a support service, that's it, you're on that journey, you need to leave and pack your bags and go. So I think if we can educate workplaces to share that with their employees that are experiencing abuse, that you can have a conversation but you're okay to go back and stay if you are safe to do so. You're just giving them step-by-step opportunities to take that control back and then maybe leave when they're ready.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Just one final question for Carrie, and I'll give you 1 minute to answer. Are there any services or resources we can signpost to specifically for colleagues who are older?
Yes, there are. So local domestic abuse services may well have something called an older people's EIDA, but they are few and far between. There are very, like everything, it's a postcode lottery. So there are two organisations I would highly recommend people look at, and I can send details. There's a national organisation called Hourglass, and if you put Hourglass Charity into a search engine, because if you put Hourglass in, it'll be a cosmetic company, and they have a 24-hour helpline and lots of resources and support services. So they work with people over the age of 60. But also, if you are being abused by a child or a grandchild, and that might be an adult grandchild or child, there's an organisation called PEGS, and again, put PEGS Charity into the search engine, otherwise you'll get a load of PEGS, closed PEGS. But they are two organisations that not only have lots of information on their websites, but also have support services available. But again, check your local services, because there might be a local specialist offer as well.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. That's brilliant. I'm going to bring it to a close. Thank you so much to our guest speakers, Sharon, Craig and Carrie, for all sharing your experiences and expertise. If there's any questions we've been unable to answer, we will send them to speakers and share them out afterwards. We're going to be sharing a summary of today's session with these slides and any key resources, with Carrie's PDF of the diagram as well. We're going to be circulating those out. The next Insight Hour is on the 13th of May, and we're going to be looking at how employers can respond to perpetrators in the workplace. And we'll share more details about the session in due course, but the link to sign up is in the chat bar now. We have a networking event on Wednesday, the 4th of June at Northumbria University. So we're taking it up to Newcastle. So if anybody is in the local area or wants to come up and join us, please do. And we're going to be looking at the impacts of domestic abuse on children and young people, considering how this directly impacts employees who are parents, carers or guardians, and what employers can do to support them. We'd love to see you there, so please do sign up if you can make it. And we also would love to know if there's any areas that you'd like us to cover in Insight Hours, so please do let us know. And we've got the feedback form where people can submit any comments that we will look at afterwards. So thank you so much for joining and enjoy the rest of your day.
Bye everyone.